Okay, welcome back to a new, really interesting talk I've been looking forward to. So this is Jesper Krogh Kristiansen. You can probably say a bit more about your background.
Yes,
yeah,
I made a slide specifically for that.
Yeah, I was kind of planning for him to do that. So he will talk about the great green grassroot explosion of the Danish indie scene.
Yes.
And it will be really interesting to try to learn something from what they have been doing in Denmark.
Yes,
so.
I also have a slide telling why it might be interesting for the future of Norwegian games.
Cool.
So I tried to...
Does that make you a zombie? Having died?
No, I think it's more about maybe reincarnation.
Ah, Jesus, not zombies.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. So to start out, thanks for having me. I'm actually really excited to be here because I've been following the Norwegian games industry like from afar or whatever you call it, like one degree of separation. And I think that it looks like some really interesting stuff is happening here. So I'm actually quite thrilled to be here and meet you. Now, my talk today is about, of course, the boom of the Danish industry. But I thought that I should start out with something about myself. I promised that already. I have a long and twisted history. Who's that guy? I started out, I have a degree from university in media science and design, so not specifically like game related. And actually for the first 6 years of my career, I worked as what was called an engagement manager at Microsoft in Denmark. That's the building up there, which actually just meant that it was my job to keep people on MSN DK for as long as humanly possible to get them to view as many banner ads as we could. Then, at the same time, I was writing for different games media, like Eurogamer, IGN, Metro Express, Danish print magazine called Gameplay. And I also did a bit of game development on the side in my spare time. And then at one point I attended one of the first incarnations of the Nordic Game Jam, where I found out that this is actually really fun. And I might actually be able to do something worthwhile. And based on that, I kind of jumped out into it and established like my own one-man freelance company. It's called Blue, where I do like freelance, both like do small games myself, but also do freelance, mostly audio work and consultancy work for other game developers. And now I'm the editor for this site called Nordic Game Bits, which is like an industry site for the Nordic games industry. I hope you all know it, otherwise you should go and check it out afterwards. And I also do like a podcast together with a colleague of mine called Julia. And then recently I actually wrote the first book on the history of the Danish games industry. Big Dreams, Small Miracles is the title in English, and it's some stuff from that this talk is based on, and some other stuff I added too. So, one could ask, why am I here? You know, what does this have to do with the future of games in Norway? Well, it's because I believe that the Norwegian games industry might be heading into a similar period of creative expansion as the Danish went through some years ago, and maybe like the same like financial or economic expansion too. And maybe game developers in Norway can use some of the learnings from Denmark to help make your own creative bloom like even better or wilder or crazier or I don't know, more economically viable than in Denmark. Yeah, so that's it. So it's get started. This is where our story starts. In 2009, the Danish games industry was in a very bad shape. The financial crisis had swept across the open plains of the local industry, taking the young, the sick, the old, the unhealthy, and even a fair number of the healthy ones. The future did not look bright. Now, to put things in perspective, these were some of the biggest game developers in Denmark at the time. And these guys, Pulse Game Labs, they died completely. Deadline Games died, actually one of the oldest companies in Denmark, who had been around for, I think, 15 years at this point. They went bankrupt. These guys went bankrupt too, around 30 people. NDS, who were doing license stuff, but also a really big company, about 60 people in Denmark. They closed too. And actually even the great beacon of Danish game development, like the AAA studio, Interactive, they went through 2 rounds of layoffs in 2008 and 2009. So all of these companies, IO declined, and all of these things closed in the years 2008, 2009. Mostly because they had, except from NDS, most of them had aspirations to be like IO Interactive. They had seen the success that IO Interactive had created with, of course, the Hitman franchise as the biggest name, and they all thought this is where money can be made. Let's go and build the next AAA developer. And the thing is that they, what they actually did was to put themselves at risk, because they moved into a market where there were a decreasing margin, increasing risks, and fewer investments, and they simply put themselves at risk. So when the financial crisis came, they all crashed. The general consensus was that this was kind of the landscape of the Danish games industry around 2009. The fire had swept through and everything had disappeared. Everything more barren of life. Would there be game development going on again? And it sounds dramatic now and maybe even hard to understand. But at the time, there were actually people were asking themselves the question, is game development actually a viable industry in Denmark? Does it have a future at all? I picked out some headlines from some of the IT press from 2009. Gaming goods over for the Danish games industry. Game over for the Danish games industry. Danish game industry on the brink of collapse. So, given headlines like these and a mental image of the Danish game development landscape like this, it was actually quite a surprise when only 2 years later, what was left was not this, but instead something more in the direction of this. A lush rainforest, where you had titles that showed a huge bloom of creativity and diversity and financial success in all different directions. And of course that leads to, or not just creative success, but also, a financial success. If you look at this graph of the revenue in the Danish games industry, the financial crisis, it makes a bump in the curve, but after that you have an upwards explosion. Since the financial crisis hit, the industry has more than doubled in size. So that leads us to an interesting question. Why? How come that this seemingly catastrophic event led to like both a cultural and a financial success. And that's what I will try to answer here today. I think that the financial crisis forced a hard reset on the Danish games industry, in that it wiped out a lot of the stuff that was already there. But I also believe that there was a number of factors that resulted in a rebuilt industry turned out to be even stronger than the one that had died. You could call it our mass extinction event. Now for a historic parallel, let's go to the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, where an asteroid crashed into the Earth and created climatic changes that darkened the sky for several years, and in effect made most of the dinosaurs extinct. In the same way, the financial crisis, especially in Denmark, was hardest on the game developers that had put themselves at risk and were large and not agile and able to adapt. And what it also did was it left an open space ready to be occupied by the new species of game developers. So I think that we should look at the factors that help the indie mammals to succeed in the aftermath of the mass extinction event. And I've tried to be to structure it a bit, so I make them into some. These are some technological factors, there are some financial factors, and there are also some knowledge factors. And knowledge, that's like it's a bit fluffy word. It's the best I had for it. Because it's also, like how you build your teams and your company and stuff like that. But I put it into the knowledge bin, so there you go. Well, let's start to look at one of the technological factors that I believed played a big role in this. And that is Unity 3D. My guess is that the majority of you who are developing games are using it today. As you may know, Unity started its life here. This is actually a street in the Nørrebro part of Copenhagen, where it was founded in 2001 in a basement apartment. And actually, the three guys, David Helgeson, Nicholas Francis, and Joachim Ante, who founded Unity in 2001, they weren't supposed to make a game engine at all. They were actually supposed to make a game. But at this point, like many others wanting to make a game, the first thing they had to do was to make their own tools, because there were really no tools around unless you knew somebody from Epic or whatever, or had $50,000 to pay for an Unreal license or something. So you start out using making your own tools, and they actually ended up making a game. This is the game they made, and my guess is none of you heard about it because it's not very spectacular. It came out in 2005, but what was more important was that they found out that the technology they used to make the game was actually, they both found that it was more interesting, it was more fun, they were actually probably also better at it, and there was a market opportunity. So they kind of turned the company around and made it into a company that made a game editor instead, which actually turned out to be a pretty good timing, because only like 2 years later the iPhone came out, and they were actually one of the first competent engines that could make games for the iPhone. So they rode on the success wave of the iPhone with their editor. So one could ask, what makes Unity 3D special, just compared to what other technology was around at the point or at the time? It focuses on workflow rather than technical excellence. Unity, they've become better, but even more so in the past and still today, it's like Unity is, well, it's easy to work with, but it's not quite as technical excellent and like the most spiffy graphics of all. They had multi-platform support pretty early. And they had what I think is like the biggest scoop that they made. They actually made like the freemium business model. Well, you can download for free music. You can actually make a game with it that will work and play. There are some advanced features. We want to unlock those. Well, you have to pay, but download the basic version for free and make something with it. Now, how did this affect the Danish games industry in this period leading up to the indie boom or during the indie boom? Well, it made sure that there were common technology across companies. I know that probably for a lot of you guys, you use Unity today, so you have kind of the same, but in Denmark it was, and still is almost extreme. It's like, it's maybe, I don't know, 85% of all developers that are using Unity. And that means that it's very easy to exchange experiences between companies, and it's very easy for you to, as a person, to move between companies. It's very, very easy for me as a freelancer. I know that whatever project I get attached to, there's an 85% chance that I'm going to work with Unity. So that's pretty cool. It is a very low barrier of entry, not necessarily because it's that easy to use. It is like easier than the early versions of like Unreal Engine and stuff, but it's more a question of, the financial. You don't have to put up any money to get started. It's well suited for smaller teams. And that leads into the thing I said about them emphasizing on workflow and ease of use. So you don't have to spend as much time figuring out the technical details. You can just get stuff done. And it gave, because Unity was placed in Denmark, Unity got a head start in the Danish market. If some of you met like the CEO, David Helgeson, he was famous like some years ago when Unity was not as big as it was today, often going around to parties in the Danish games industry and handing out keys. So anybody he thought was interesting, and he did like a lot of lobbying, getting into like educations and making sure like, oh, you should have some free Unity licenses. So he made sure that all the students would learn to use the technology. But because Unity was ingrained in the Danish games industry from an early point, that also meant that in some aspects the Danish games industry had a head start in the mobile segment. Because the success of the iPhone and mobile games came as a surprise to a lot of people. But in Denmark, a lot of people already knew how to use Unity and thereby could make games for mobile, from mobiles and tablets today. And also gave a head start in multi-platform development. Because that's a thing you do a lot today, is to do a step model, because, well, you have small teams, so what you're going to do, well, you're going to finish your game on one platform and then you can port it to the other platforms fairly easily. I should probably be more careful about saying that. I sound like a Unity spokesperson. I'm not. I have been part of teams porting stuff through Unity to other platforms, and yes, it can be hell, I know, but still it's better than some of the alternatives. And that turned out to be like a pretty viable model for indie development. So like start on one platform because you only have like limited dev resources, and then after you've done that, you can move on and port it to other platforms pretty easily. And Unity allows you to do that. Then we move on to another technological factor, which is digital distribution. This is not like limited to Denmark. This is the global, where you have all of these, and the App Store coming, growing together with the iPhone at the period. Steam had been around for some years, but are really accelerating at this point around 2008-2009. And you also, like the digital distribution on the consoles also really begins to come into play at this point. I believe, what is it? Like the first Summer of Arcade, I think that's 2009 or something. Yeah. So I'm assuming that everybody knows these, so I'm just going to jump straight to the significance for the Danish games industry. And so I'm guessing only you know what Steam is. Again, this also gives like a lower barrier of entry, mostly because there's a much larger number of titles released. So that also means that you don't have to go through like the same gatekeepers. In like the old AAA days, you know, the only model for releasing a game was like a retail game, and that has like a much higher investment, so fewer titles would get through. But here with digital, they can release a lot more titles and a lot more gets through. And you don't have to do the huge investment that a retail title requires, you know, printing discs and boxes and stuff like that. Yeah, the gatekeepers, I already covered that. It also made for a much easier international market access. You know, at the App Store, Steam, or at least those two, they're like global by nature. So you get access to like a global market almost immediately, which means that you can also you can do games that focus on small segments. Because if you have a global reach, you can address like a very narrow segment in each country. Because if you reach out globally, well, those segments will be enough for you to make to get by or make a viable business out of it. Yeah, and sorry, that was a leftover from the other one. Yeah, and it also opened the mid-tier segment on console PC, meaning that you had a new market segment open up where there wouldn't be the price and the scope would be smaller than AAA. Because the problem you would have in the period before that was that either you were AAA or you were nothing. Then you were like, you could make some flash games, and that's it. So that you had to get up to the AAA level to be able to release a game. But here, now you could do like a mid-core game. So you could do like, either you could have the ambition of moving up to AAA through AA or this middle segment, or you could just say, this is where I want to be. Because, of course, in the middle segment, risks are also much smaller, because the investments are much smaller. So let's move on to some finance stuff. That's always fun. One thing, and I should warn you, I have inserted one stupid joke in my presentation, and we're up for it. It's about cat signs. That's your joke, yeah. Okay. Now we're done with it. Now it's going to be serious from now on. Cat Science is actually the name of an investment fund. So to give you a quick recap of Cat Science, a semi-public investor focusing on innovation with a special focus on games since 2006. So you could say that they were a bit early, relating to the indie boom in Denmark, but what was and they usually invest between $0.5 and $3.5 million in short perspective projects, 2 to 3 years, and only in Danish productions. And I think at the time they invested something around 10 million each year, and today it's a bit more. I think it's 16 or 18. And Cat Science significant for the Danish games industry. It was actually pretty big. I can say right now, before I put on my bullet point up, that Cat Science actually invested in both Subway Surfers and Limbo, which are probably the two biggest Danish game successes after 2010. But what they created was a local game investment expertise, because they focused on game investment as one of their core focus areas, and that meant that they got smarter at it. Because game investment is very specialized, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's a hard sell. And it's hard. I can hear that one of you were talking about troubles getting, investors to invest money, and that's because it's very specialized and it's hard to understand because it is this weird mixture of, culture and passion and media and the business at the same time. So it's very hard to understand and find out what's going to be a success, what's not going to be a success. But Cat Science got some of that expertise because they invested in the area and focused on it. And of course the investment side, suitable for smaller projects, well, that fits well with like indie developments, smaller teams, smaller scope for the games, smaller projects. And they had already learned their lessons around 2008, 2009 as a lecture on how difficult game development investment is. All of the companies that Cat Science invested on in the first year went bankrupt. So, but around this time they had figured out how to do it, at least to a degree. And also an investor on the developer's own level, in that it was not Cat Science weren't this huge, giant American investor that could just steamroll over you. They were kind of on your own level. They can still be assholes when they want their money, of course, but it's not some giant American corporation that are bullying you into oblivion. And more finance, DeFi funding. DeFi, of course, stands for the Danish Film Institute. So, and I'm guessing that that's kind of what you have in Norway as well.
Jesper?
What?
Can I ask a question about the Cat Science?
Sure.
The ownership, who owns Cat Science?
I believe it's set up with its own board, but and they have some private. So you can invest in Cat Science, and they will funnel investments into separate companies. But I think that's somewhere around. Maybe at that point, 80% of the money was public, either from the state or from regions.
So it would be something like Voss in Norway, if you know Voss?
I don't.
Okay.
But if you ask me, if you tell me afterwards what Voss is, I could probably come with a pretty accurate answer on how close the two are.
And also a very interesting question, very short, is Cat Science profitable or are they losing money?
Cat Science is profitable on the game side. Thing is, they are actually today, they are funding some of the more unsuccessful areas of the investments with the money from games.
Cool.
Subway Surfers alone has made them a lot of money. So they're actually, which is, I have a lot of stories to tell because that makes you wonder, because they're successful in game investments, but nobody else wants to touch it, and I can't understand why. I don't know. It's a weird situation. I have some theories about it, but I think that's maybe fitting for the dinner later tonight. Okay. Just to recap what DFI funding is, because I'm not 100% certain of all the details of the NFI funding, so just to address what this is. Public cultural support to development of prototypes and betas of games of cultural value with a focus on children and youth since 2008, when the program was started. They had up to 1 million Danish crowns in support from a total budget per year of 5 million at the point it was started. Now it's a little more than 10 million. This was also very important for the Danish games industry at the time, because it encouraged experimentation. It's like it's much easier to just fool around and do some funny stuff with public funding. instead of having some private investor looking over your shoulder. And again, the funding size here is suitable for smaller projects, again leading into it being suitable for indie game development. You know, you won't get anywhere with like 1 million Danish crowns on a AAA game. I won't even cover the coffee budget. And what it also did was it trained applicants in the pitching process. The guy who made the guidelines for how to apply for the DFI funding, he was actually an old veteran from IO Interactive, a guy called Thomas Hover, who works at the Danish Academy for Interactive Entertainment or something, at game education. But he thought that, well, how can we, he knew that the funding alone in this program would not be nearly enough to cover like the full development costs of any sizable game project. So we thought, how can I help them in another way than just money? So he actually made, he was hired to make like the application process for the program. So he made sure that the application process for the DFI funding is as close to a normal pitching process to an investor or publisher as possible. So even if you don't get money, or even if you do get money, you also get the added gift of having learned a bit about how to pitch your project. And it also acted as live support for some developers. Rune also talked about, you know, incubators, and even if they weren't necessarily, you know, it wasn't like people were funneled into the film institute and put down in the basement and sit there down and incubate, we're gonna throw some cup noodles and money down to you. It still worked as a live support while some of these companies got their act together. So yeah, it was school money for others. For some, because live support, for some it was a way to tide over in the hard times between projects, because in this period it was very, very difficult to find publishers and investors, because everybody was sitting very tightly on their money and only putting money in things that were like 100% safe. And some could like tide over and wait for better times while doing like experimentation and stuff for the public money. And for others it was like, it was a learning process. And maybe they made some crap that didn't work out, but I'm pretty sure they got wiser in the process. Then we reached the third category, knowledge. And then we have Spilhuset. I don't know if you know Spilhuset. Here I took like, this is just a photo of next to the doorbells, some of the companies that are there. Which is actually, I thought it was pretty funny hearing the presentation from the Hammer Game Collective. Because the Spilhuset is actually like a proto version of that. Not that it was not made in the same official manner. But Spilhuset is, I actually have a picture of it. Looks like this. It is this building in central Copenhagen, where in 2009, some Danish game developers just decided, well, let's rent this house together. They had been sitting out on, they were like a startup incubator, some physical space at the IT University where they had been sitting, but there were some limits on how long you could sit there, so they were getting kicked out. I thought, well, let's rent this place together, and they did. So, what is Spilhuset? Not a building, inhabited almost exclusively by game developers. And I would call it an informal incubator. And it's also the location of some pretty good parties. As most of you probably know, good parties are essential for indie development. Yeah. And I actually think that this is one of the most important factors in the indie games boom that came at that point. Because it enabled the sharing of knowledge in a very, very informal way. But just because, you know, talking together with people at parties, you get ideas, you tell them about your experiences, Also just living upstairs and downstairs from each other, or just, you know, there's a desk next to you, which makes it very, very easy to talk about what you've done and what the results were and what other people are doing. And it also created an informal community among developers. Because there were some problems, because at least at this point, Danish game developers, they weren't organized as such. Of course, there is in Denmark Producentforening. I believe it actually has the same name in Norway, just spelled a bit differently, which is supposedly the what's it called? The trade union or something for the game developers. But the thing is that they had a pretty steep price for being a member. At this point, I think it was about 15,000 Danish kroner a year. And if you're an indie developer, you can calculate how many cup noodles that will buy you. That's a lot of month of development time. So a lot of indie developers like skipped on that. So they weren't actually like organized in any way. And also there's a whole other problem about the Producentforening, where you often have Producentforening representing both games and film and TV. And often they're fighting for the same money. And I'm pretty sure the situation is the same in Norway as it's in Denmark, in that there are no competition regarding who are most talented and lobbying. The film are kicking games' ass every time. So, but in the Spilhuset, game developers could just be themselves and have a collective feeling of being something together. It also gave the industry a physical location. It was like, it became second, what's it called? Like, it became a logical thing. If you were going to do something for the Danish game industry, do it in the Spilhuset. Well, we're going to do the Christmas lunch for the Danish games industry in Spilhuset. Oh, I'm going to do like a talk on, I don't know, weird Japanese torture porn games. I'll come do it at Spilhuset. And it created the feeling of actually being an industry. Because we could prop each other up and say, we are doing good stuff. Yeah, we are. And that can also be really, really helpful. Instead of sitting around being isolated, that can also be tough sometimes. Now, around the same time, there also came something called Computerspilzonen, which is today called Denmark. Had this logo? Wow. So what is Computerspilzonen? Let me tell you. It's a state-funded agency to investigate games as a cultural growth business, together with, I think, food, fashion, and one more thing I can't remember. And they host a number of talks and workshops focusing primarily on the business side of games. And as I said, they now are called Interactive Denmark. But it's the same organization in like broad terms. But what did this mean for the Danish game industry at the time? Well, it enabled a better business understanding in small startups. Something that is sometimes direly needed in game development, where often the interest is to like, I'm gonna put my ass in the seat, I'm gonna code something cool, something fun, and not necessarily sitting down and saying, what are my revenue streams going to be? Because, you know, if you want to make game number 2, you need to get some money in the bank at some point. It also created an alternative venue for networking. There still were some that weren't in Spilhuset, but at least they could meet here and talk with each other and meet each other. And I actually started out, when I started in the games business, I met a lot of my contacts through them. They had some workshops called Growing Games, where it's like you had some knowledge and some speakers, but the networking part was just as important. Also, they did some political lobbying. They still do, and have had at least some success. Now at least the politicians acknowledge that they don't care about games instead of just outright ignoring it. They also help profile computer games as a serious business. Saying that actually trying to tell both politicians and like the public at large saying, look, we are actually generating a revenue of more than 500 million Danish kroner each year. It's not just fun and games and toys and waste of time. It's actually a real business making real money. Especially if you look at like export revenue, it's like beating a lot of other cultural sectors. And it also introduced like a classic startup entrepreneur features to the industry. As I told about it, they were responsible for a large part of going out to game developers saying, I know you love making games and being creative, but you should also think about how you're gonna make money on your game. And you should also think about maybe about how you're gonna market it and how you're gonna make sure people are gonna buy it and people know about it. And I have like this, which is more like miscellaneous stuff. It's also knowledge stuff. It's called minor stuff that I think played a role, but weren't like super essential. And that is like Nordic Game Jam. I hope you know it. It's the biggest single game jam in the world. And it's actually where I got my first taste of game development, at least together with others. I'm not just sitting at home. And it's significant in a couple of ways. One is that it has a networking function as well, and it has a networking function on a Nordic level. And it also introduced the jamming as a model for idea development, or like just trying out crazy stuff and trying out ideas, which actually today is accepted as a very, very useful way of like exploring new possibilities. It's you can only look at what are Oculus doing, and Facebook doing to get some great ideas about what you can use VR for. Well, they're hosting a jam. And it actually also led to some companies being funded. Knap Games, if you know them, they were actually their first game was a development of a game jam prototype. Then you also have Daddio, which I mentioned before, which is like the major Danish games education, which is kind of an education that resides like on top of other normal education. You have like programmers and graphic artists and stuff, and then they can go half a year and work together in the Daddio, where they make some games. And Daddio, it started in 2005, but around this time, 2008 and 2009, it began to produce some more interesting stuff. And this contributed to the wave of Danish indie games in the way that Daddio, at least in this period, had a focus on being, I don't know, probably call it artsy in exploring games as a medium for doing crazy stuff. And if you look at some of the games from the period that came out with Daddio, which are like, I don't know, you know them, it's like, there's one called A Mother's Inferno, which is just like a psyched out trip on LSD, really weird. And there's one called 1916, The Unknown War. It's black and white, and you're running around trenches in the First World War being hunted by a dinosaur that's representing the senselessness of war. Really weird stuff, but also really, really interesting stuff. And of course, these crazy people, they ended out came out into the indie environment and continued with at least some of the same creativity and will to explore new directions there. And also, of course, One of you mentioned this as well, because Denmark at least had this is like a phoenix, right? That dies and rises again by a phoenix. Denmark at least had a somewhat sizable industry before the financial crisis hit. So what happened is that at least some of these people, they remained in the industry and they just moved around to some of the new developers. So some of the new developers got some veterans that were from the companies that folded, but they brought all of their experience and knowledge with them into these new companies, where they to make sure that they didn't start completely from zero. Now, I try to like sum it up in a nice way, right? You have the hard reset, which is the financial crisis, the crash. You have the technical stuff that's happening. You have digital distribution. You have Unity 3D, which is pretty specific for Denmark. You have some financial stuff happening. You have CAT science, DFI funding, and you have the knowledge bit, which is like the Spilhus, the Interactive Denmark, and miscellaneous factors. Now, we get to the stuff. It's interesting here. I just made a conclusion. Try to make a conclusion based on this. The Danish games industry made an extremely fast pivot towards indie games, digital distribution, and distribution of knowledge. This was made possible by the hard reset that circumstances forced upon the industry and a number of supporting factors coinciding with this reset. And now we reach the part that's interesting for you guys. I'll be honest to say, feel free to correct me, because I'm looking at Norway as an outsider, and of course I don't have nearly the same knowledge about the Norwegian games industry as the Danish one. I've seen, like, for the last maybe 1 or 2 years now, there's an explosion of creativity coming from Norway that seems to resemble, at least in some points, what happened in Denmark in 2009 and 10. And looking like broadly at how it looks in Norway, where you missed the hard reset, you had the financial crisis, and I know that Funcom had a whole ton of trouble, but it seems that it weren't the same mass extinction event as in Denmark. You have the same digital distribution, even though we're a bit later in the cycle now. Well, it's still like increasing in importance. You also have some financial stuff, and you have NFI funding, which is actually a good deal bigger than in Denmark, which is, and then maybe you're beginning to see some investment fatigue in Finland and Sweden. Because Finland and Sweden, especially Finland, they are, every investor is looking for the next supercell. And maybe it seems like they might be willing to look a bit at similar markets where they can get more for their money. So I think this could be an opportunity both for Denmark and for Norway to say that, hey, we can actually do a lot of the same stuff they do in Finland and Sweden, but you get more for your money over here. And then you have like the knowledge part, where I think that you're very well represented. You have Spilmarkedlaget, JoinGame, to put on here. And this is, I think, interesting. James Portnow from Extra Credits, he suggested this. I don't know. I think that could be a point for discussion, because that's kind of both those, and will that solve the problems? But in any case, also you have Hammer, which is like, seems to be doing a lot of the same things that Spilhus does, even if it's a bit more formalized. So in conclusion on Norway, I would say that the Norwegian games industry is showing some of the same creative traits that was present in Denmark 2009 to 12. But I think the reformation has been slower because of the absence of a hard reset and fewer supporting factors, especially outside the knowledge segment. And that was it. So, if there are any questions. Yes?
I wondered something, because you had the speed zone,
yes,
which looked at different cultural industries, and also talked about them as financial industries.
Mm-hmm.
And can you say something about, about how the difference between, or how the fusion is between games being culture and games being an industry?
Yes, I think what you have in Denmark is that you, at least you, even if you don't act it out completely, you have an understanding of games as standing on two legs, standing on a cultural leg and on a business leg. And Computerspilzone was pretty, they focused on the business leg. and saying that others have to take care of the cultural part, and acknowledging that games is cultural products as well, but for them that's not what they're focusing on, and actually maybe a bit deferring and saying that DFI should handle the culture part of it, because they are like, what they're handing out is cultural support that should focus on games of cultural value. But I will say that's actually probably a problem, or has been up to now. But maybe as a reaction to this, in the new film agreement that also includes games, that was made just before this fall, they actually put it into the agreement that the Film Institute has to make a game office. So I think that's a way to try and say we have to have something that can do some of the similar things that Computerspilszonen did for the business side. We need to have someone who can do something similar for the culture side of games. If that answers the question.
Yeah.
Yes?
What people is in the Danish games? Is it the old people from the old companies, or is it a lot of new people, young people, or what is the connection?
I'd say it's mostly young people or younger. What usually happens is, because indie game development is like a full-time job plus, what happens is, of course, you have some of the old veterans that go into the new companies, and they come with their knowledge and experience. But also a lot of them, maybe they tend to go towards game developers that do things that are more calculated. I don't know. At least in Denmark we have this thing called Movie Star Planet, which I think is pretty hideous, but it's like a game / social media for like tweens. And I know that, for example, a lot of the people that was fired from IO Interactive, they went there and got a job. But it's like, well, they're not making Hitman, but they get to go home at 5:30 every day, have a life and a family on the side. Which is like, it plays into a whole other aspect of the problems of indie development. So that's why I only put it like as a supporting factor, because a lot of the people that was fired, they moved into other industries or moved into parts of the games industry where they can have a family too, because usually they are a bit older and might have family and kids in the house, and obligations. Yes, we'll take you again first.
Thank you. I think it's very nice, very interesting listening to what you're telling about Denmark and how things have developed there since the financial crisis. In Norway, the crisis was not that big, but I believe that the industry in Denmark got more hungry as the crisis were a lot bigger and deeper, and the key difference, as I see, would be Computerspilszonen making a bridge that creates a deeper understanding of the needs of an investor and also for the gaming companies, because in Norway the understanding is not there. I think a lot of the gaming companies does not understand what the investors wants and needs, and it's exactly the same on the investor side for the gaming companies.
Yeah.
That's something we really miss.
I think you're right, because that's one organization where I can't find a direct copy or similar thing in Norway of Computerspilszonen. And I think, and you're absolutely right about the hungry part, but I think that kind of also stems from what Spillehuset did, because that's one of the things about finding a collective identity as game developers and being the games industry of Denmark, is that it was like, we're gonna fight, supporting each other, and also there was also, I think, games felt that they were being treated unfairly compared to what cultural impact they actually had on how many people and how much money they actually generated as a business. So it made a kind of a, at least in my experience, like a defiant feeling of, we are gonna show those film assholes, we don't need your freaking money crutch. We're gonna make our money ourselves, even if it's gonna kill us doing it. We don't care. And there was kind of that feeling. Maybe even a bit today, but at that point it was really powerful that we're gonna show those idiot assholes, officials, politicians, you name it, and we're gonna do it ourselves. So yeah. Yes?
Okay, we're talking about it being hard to get private investors to. And I mean, the thing is the same here. A bit for Norway is the case that Norwegian investors generally have oil to invest into.
Yeah, so why should they bother with games?
But like, when you're saying that the business in Denmark is $1 million, it's a big industry, right? It's a lot of revenue.
Yeah, it's about 800 million Danish kroner.
Yeah, why do you think that investors are still hesitant? Is it something the gaming companies are doing wrong, or is it just a cultural thing?
I think there are several factors. One thing is that it's hard to understand game investment. Game investment is special, because what you normally do when you invest in a startup or like a growth company is that everybody agrees that the end point is to have what's called an exit, which is when you sell your company to somebody bigger, an investment, hedge fund, whatever. And you're aiming towards that's your end point. But that's different with game developers. Because for most founders of game development studios, their objective is to continue making games. They're not necessarily interested in selling it. And that creates a conflict of interest between an investor and the founders of the studio. So you have to circumvent that in some way and make a special case. And I think a lot of investors, they say, I'm going to do the model I understand and I use normally, otherwise I won't do it. What they do with Capnova, or Cat Science as it was called at that point, now it's Capnova, the investment fund, is that they made a special model where they made a separate company for the production of like one title. So that it would be like one company that could be pulled apart afterwards, after the project was done. And then they wouldn't have that problem. I think that's one reason. Another reason is that there is actually a very, very big fund in Denmark, a public fund called Vækstfonden, the growth fund. And they used to invest in games, they don't anymore. And they are actually very, very reluctant to tell why. It actually seems like they're a bit pissed for some reason. I have a couple of theories as to why. Because they got some bad press, because they were considering investing in one of the companies that went under the financial crisis. And some of the people from that company, they went out in the media and were really, really harsh in their critique of the growth fund afterwards. So maybe they said, we're not going to bother with that because we don't want bad press and hating us just because we don't want to put money in your company. And I think that's another reason, because if the public money, if even the Vækstfonden, the growth fund, who are put in the world to help companies grow and are meant to take a loss at it, if even they won't go into game investment, why should I do? Because I'm a private investor and I want my money back. So it sends a signal that games are not worth investing in, even if you're ready to take a loss at it. Is my guess. Yes?
So many questions. I don't need to pick which one I want. I was wondering if there is any growth in supporting industries. Like, is there anybody specializing in PR? Are there indie publishers in Denmark? And is there anything growing out surrounding the game industry?
There are some, yes. I will say, specifically regarding PR and marketing, Denmark is fucked. There are one company in Denmark who does it, and they do it like very, very, they only do like very classical style, Here's a press release and a review code. that won't necessarily. Of course, it depends on your game. If you're making like a kids game that's supposed to be sold to the parents, fine, you can probably get by on it. But if you're doing something that's supposed to be like streamed on YouTube and stuff like that, you're pretty fucked. Unless you can do it yourself. Of course, you can do it yourself if you're savvy at it, and that's always best. If you're a game developer and you have the time and resources, it's always most believable if it comes from the developer themselves. But there are some supporting industries, game analytics, who are like making, of course, analytical tools for games. They are in Denmark. They've got some investment now, and they're growing pretty fast. Of course, Unity. But I wouldn't say, there's not like a whole ecosystem. So, but that's probably also because of the internet and stuff. So for some, it's instead of trying to go out and do something themselves or to create a publisher themselves, well, they can find a publisher in another country, for example, and maybe even in another Nordic country. You know, you can Paradox is doing a lot of indie stuff, so and stuff from other countries too. So.
I think since we're having lunch now, you can have a million questions from him during lunch, I think.
Yes.
So I think we just continue, you know, with the questions and talk, because there's so many things. So a big hand for Jesper. Yes.